Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I want to go over the topic of muddiness in your mix and a few techniques you can use to address it. So when we're talking about muddiness, what we are usually talking about is a lack of clarity in the lower mids, which is roughly between 200 to 500 hertz, more or less. So what muddiness usually sounds like is a lack of definition and things just don't sound clear or punchy. And so we wouldn't describe this as a harsh sound, but rather an overall just sort of bleh sound that's very common in mixing. The thing is, muddiness usually is around that 200 to 500 hertz range, which I mentioned, but this is also where the warmth and the body of the song really lives, and also where most of the fundamental frequencies of most instruments live as well. So, because of this, it's not usually an individual bad sound. It's an overlapping of several instruments which are competing for the same space. So that being said, for me, 9 times out of 10, muddiness usually comes from the arrangement and not the actual mix itself. So generally what that means is there's likely too many instruments playing at one given time in the song, like pads, keyboards, guitars, vocals, or even bass instruments that are living all together in this really crucial range. To address this, you could do a number of things. First, you can ask yourself what's really needed at each part of the song and, if possible, just cut it out completely. For example, do you need both a synth and a guitar line happening during the verse and the chorus together? Or can they take turns, so the synth is in the verse and the guitar plays in the chorus, for example? If you have several layers like this happening at the same time, try muting each of them to see if they're really needed and if it's really enhancing the feel and the groove of your track. If they are both needed, then there are some options we can try. I'm going to give you 5 of my favorite options to address muddiness. The first option would be to simply readjust the levels of those instruments. So ask yourself which one is more important and which ones may be playing a more supportive role, and just bring down the volume of that one that doesn't need to be so upfront. This may sound really simple, but honestly, a lot of times just readjusting the levels will solve a lot of our problems. That is an easier approach to doing a ton of processing and possibly even over-processing our tracks. The second option I recommend would be to add a subtractive EQ to one of the elements and see if that clears things up. Remember that EQing in solo mode, though, for too long is generally not a good idea because mixing is all about balancing the elements of a song altogether and not getting one individual sound just completely perfect by itself. EQing in solo can be great for honing in on problematic frequencies or doing some creative effects, but when it comes to balance, you want to listen to all the elements in context within the entire mix. All right, let's take a quick look at an example I have here in this session. I'm going to loop this verse right here, and we have some instruments happening and also a drum loop and a bass line. The elements we have going on in the instruments are some horns, some stab chords, and a melody guitar. And down here we have our bass line and our drum loop down here. So let's take a listen. I've undone all of my EQ settings, and let's just take a listen to this verse. We can go in and do some EQing on these individual parts like I mentioned and cut out some of those areas that are competing. So for me, what I'm hearing right now is between this melody guitar and the horns. Let's listen right here and just solo out the horns and the melody guitar. So as they're playing at the same time, you can hear there's a little overlap. So what I've done here is cut out a little bit already in this 391 range and also put a high pass filter on it. So let's listen to before and after. So here's before. Sounds a little congested, and if I engage this EQ and cut out this little bit here, or quite a bit, almost 7 dB. That already sounds more clear, like each element has a little more room to breathe. I've also done something similar here on these stab chords. I had an EQ cutting out quite a bit of the low frequency content. Because with all these other instruments, we really don't need this stuff going on down here. And another thing that's important to notice is that the stab chords are coming in at the moment when the guitar and the horns are not playing. Let's listen to the three of those. It's almost like a call and response sort of thing here. And I mentioned we don't want to listen in solo mode too much, so let's unsolo these. And something I like to do as well is on the groups is put in an EQ, and in this way everything that's in this group is being affected by this one EQ. And in this case, I put a high-pass filter at 150 hertz. This is quite a bit, but it does leave a lot more room for the drums and the bass to breathe. So what I'm going to do is engage and disengage this EQ, and let's listen in context with the drums and bass. And with the EQ engaged, now to me that's just a lot more clean. I can hear the kick drum and the snare drum a lot more defined rather than getting too caught up in the frequency range of the other instruments. The third option I want to talk about would be to reconsider the range the instrument is playing in. So, for example, if you have a guitar playing some held out chords in that low mid register, and also a synth pad playing chords that are basically in that same register, try changing the inversion of the chord that either instrument is playing. So for example, that pad I'm talking about, if it's played in with MIDI notes, you could simply drag the lowest note up an octave, and possibly even the second lowest note up another octave, so that way all the notes are the same, but the inversion is different. This might not suit your song, but it's a good way to try to clear up space so that the guitar that we were talking about in this example could live in that lower mid-range, and the pad would be playing the same chords, but maybe just a little higher in the range to make room for each instrument. The fourth option would be to consider the stereo field and moving some of your instruments left or right. You don't need to go hard left and hard right, although sometimes that sounds really cool, but sometimes just pushing them out a little more in the stereo field can clear up a lot of space. Let's look at a quick example of how we can take those horns, those stab chords, and the guitar part and pan them just to give them some more separation in the stereo field. So I'm going to go ahead and center them all so they're right in the center of the image, and let's listen to how that sounds. So you can hear they're just sitting on top of each other. But let's do a hard pan right with the stab chords and a hard pan left with the melody guitar, just to hear what that sounds like. Now that's quite a bit, so I'm going to bring this back down to maybe, let's try 35 or so. Let's listen to how that sounds, or maybe 30. Just take a listen. So right about there, 40 with the stab and 36 with the melody, I think sounds great. And it definitely adds a lot more width, and you can hear the individual instruments much more clear than if they were all centered right down the middle. And lastly, reverb can also very often be a culprit when a mix has too much mud as well. Since reverb usually has a really long delay time, if there's several instruments with reverb in that low mid-range, it can turn into a giant washy mess with all of those frequencies that are held out in that range even when the notes are finished. So some solutions here could be to EQ out some of the low content of the reverb, which is really easy to do if you have your reverb set up on a bus. You can just add an EQ after the reverb and put a high pass and just maybe move it up to 300, 400, 500 hertz. You could also try it with shortening the decay time on your reverb. And I know sometimes it sounds really nice to have a really long reverb, but shortening it down from maybe like a 2 or 3 second reverb to a 1 second can really clean up a lot of space. And last thing to mention too is that you don't need every instrument running through a big reverb. So maybe just try choosing one instrument to be the one that's more lush and full of reverb, and the other instruments back them off a little bit and make them a little more dry. All right, here we are back in Ableton. Let's take a quick listen to the instrument soloed with this reverb bus I have here. So the instruments that I have going to the reverb are the horns, the stab chords, and the melody, and they're all being sent to this return, which I have this Valhalla vintage reverb set up. So I'm going to solo out the instruments, and I've turned up the decay quite a bit so that it's around 4 or 5 seconds. And I have an EQ here that's not really doing much in the low mids, and I have the low cut all the way down. So there's not really a lot of dampening right now. Let's listen. Now that's a lot of reverb and much more than I would want to use, but I turned it up just to show the example that after the notes finish playing, you can hear how much length there is in the reverb that's adding to that muddiness down here in that 200, 300, 400 range. So a few options here is we can filter it out, bring this up a little higher. If we want to keep a long reverb like that, let's listen to how this sounds. But there's still a lot there, so I'm going to go ahead and back this off. Let's bring this down to about 1 second or so and see how this sounds. So you can hear there's still a decent amount of reverb, but we've cut out some of that low mid material and we brought down the decay time, and that's definitely cleaned it up a lot. So there you have it. Try these 5 easy fixes to clean up the low mid area in your mix. And I guarantee you that if you try any of these 5 techniques, your mixes will right away start to sound a lot more clear and defined. And remember, if you like the content on this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in leveling up your production game, check out the link in the description to my online course in music production, where you get access to a private community of like-minded producers and also weekly Q&A calls with myself. Happy producing, and I'll see you next time.